Museum and Archives. I'm here with Channing. Hello, Channing, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's very nice to see you, and it's also nice to see my colleague, Ema. Ema, are you back there? Just wave to everybody. Thank you. Ema is there doing all of the technical support for us, and so thank you very much. So this series of talks and readings and lectures started at the beginning of COVID, and it really is a way for us to bring new voices to Stonewall, and it's been great. This might be episode number 35 or 36. We've been doing one almost every single week, and so if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat or to the Q&A. And also hello to our friends on Facebook. A lot of people do get this information from there as well too, and you can feel free to pose a quick question there as well. This talk is being recorded, and it will go up on our website at stonewall-museum.org, as all the past talks are, and so you can tell your friends and you can share it with them as well too. Right now at the museum, we are open, and we have all the COVID rules in place there, and so if you are in South Florida, please feel free to come and stop by. The library has 28,000 volumes in it. It's believed to be one of the largest LGBTQ libraries in the world. And the archive is 2,700 linear feet of material. So if you imagine that would be all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other. It represents 6 million pages of LGBTQ history, mostly going back to the early 1950s to the present day. For those of you who are interested in doing research or studying things, please feel free to contact us at stonewall-museum.org to be able to make an appointment. We have 2 exhibitions up right now. One is called Off Our Backs, curated by Megan Kent from the Hollywood Center for Arts and Culture, and it's looking at early lesbian publications from the 1950s to 2000, talks about issues about how lesbian publications were used around different themes. So it was either about sexual oppression or political power or identifying self. And so it's a deep dive into those issues and some of those serials. Also, and that's in the Roscoe Gallery. In the Hestergate Gallery, we have an exhibition called The Saint, and it is ephemera and materials from the legendary disco in the Lower East Side in New York from 1981 to 1988, called The Saint, and it was put together by the owners of that disco and the legendary St. Mark's Baths in New York. And so they're beautiful posters that were sent out to members and that's all up on the walls right now too. The Saint will be coming down in about 2 weeks. So if you are in South Florida and you want to come see it, now's the time to come to do it. And there's also a virtual version of it on our website, as well as the curator talk. When that show comes down, the next show is called Don't Ask, Do Tell. And it is the entire relationship between the United States military and LGBTQ individuals, starting with George Washington's lieutenant who helped shape the Army in 1778, and it ends with Joe Biden's removal of the transgender ban and a lot of the details that happened in between. So that will be opening, I believe the date is May 21st. And so that show will be coming. To stay informed about everything that we do, of course, go to stonewall-museum.org and sign up for our newsletter. And we send out a weekly newsletter every week as well, too. So those are all the announcements that I have to make. And so Channing, Channing, where are we finding you this evening? Where are you?
Zooming in from sunny Los Angeles, California.
Yeah. How have you been dealing with the pandemic?
I've been muddling through the best I can. I teach for my livelihood at the University of Southern California, and we've been Zooming in for all of our classes. I have not been to campus all year. Wow. So there's a benefit to that, which is that I can keep my job and life goes on. And there's a downside, which is that I'm staring at a screen all day.
Yeah.
So,
It is one of the, it's one of the awful parts about all this. But you know, it also, I couldn't imagine doing a series like this before COVID, where we would be bringing the people in from all over the country to do it. And also gives you the opportunity to speak to other audiences throughout the country as well too.
absolutely, I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, which is great. Well, so I know everybody's seen a copy of your bio, but of course, as you say, you're teaching at University of Southern California at the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism, and you've won many honors and awards. And one, of course, one of the things that I was thrilled to see here is you won a Whitington Foundation Award, which is just great. Congratulations on that. And and you really, you know, you've worked in a variety of different publications. And so I guess I would like to sort of just dive right in to William Dorsey Swann, because before I before we started working on this talk, I, like many people involved in the queer community, had no idea who they were.
Mm.
Um, and and so it was fascinating to see this person that was born in slavery ended up might being one of the first drag performers in the United States, and we're talking mid 19th century, 1860s or so. So tell us a little bit, how did you discover William Dorsey Swann, and how did they become a fascination for you?
Well, first I should probably say, I use he, him, and she, her pronouns alternately depending on the context. I don't typically use they, them. I say that because I find that the archive of William Dorsey Swann indicates that that's how he used pronouns as well. So in his daily life, he lived as a man, and in special circumstances, he reigned as queen of the underground, queer underground of Washington, D.C. Um, other historians may take a different approach. That's my approach. I tend to use the terms and pronouns that I can see through research are used by the people that I do research on. That said, I was always a bit of a nerd. I was obsessed with my learning more about my African American heritage when I was a younger person. And as I was sort of building my family tree back in time, I had the thought, where would I fit on this family tree? Where would another queer person fit on this family tree? You know, typically, you know, traditionally, genealogy is the recording of heterosexual behavior. It is a record of heterosexual behavior, and there's not an automatic place for queer people to fit into that. And so that got me sort of obsessed with the idea of what is a queer ancestor? What would that look like? And so I veered off into collecting as sort of as much material as I could at the time on people who were Black and queer of the past, my concept of a Black queer ancestor. In that process, I encountered a newspaper article that was really sort of began this whole journey. It was a Washington Post article that I will talk about on my slides later, but it described a raid, a police raid on a drag ball. They were using the term drag, and it was my first understanding that the tradition of drag went back in time that far.
Mm. And it made me ask the quick question, which I didn't answer. But what do we know what the origin of drag, the term itself is?
Um, there's some mystery surrounding it, and it's a complicated story. There are some theories. You know, the word drag existed for some time in the record before the term drag queen existed. So those are two separate concepts.
Hmm.
But the term drag, as far as I can determine, was the earliest that I reference that I can find to it being used in a public document was in the 1860s. And it was, by 1870, it was obviously in wide use in both the United States and in England, where there was a huge trial over aristocrats who were caught dressing in drag.
Yeah. Of course, in this period, in the mid 19th centuries or the 1860s or so, not every state had laws against sodomy at the time, but many of them did. And of course, the country was very rural there as well too. There were certain parts of the period, of course, that slavery was in place, and then of course there was the Civil War and everything that was happening there. But it was really it really was a rural nation. And as we think about a lot of queer life, a lot of that is associated with the idea of urban centers that we think about today. And of course, he was in Washington, D.C., which was an urban center at the time. But, would I be right in saying that actually the word homosexual had not even been created at this time. I mean, it was just an act that somebody did. They would commit same-sex acts as opposed to being considered as we consider individuals today as being gay or queer or lesbian or something else.
Exactly. A lot of the terms we use today did not exist, or if they existed, were used only by specialists. So the term homosexual had been invented in the 1860s, but was used pretty much exclusively in German publications until the 1890s.
Yeah.
By German medical researchers. So the everyday people did not use terms like homosexual or invert. Those were specialist terms, and you often see a lot of my work is done through research in newspapers, and oftentimes I see the reporters struggling to find euphemisms and other ways of describing the people that they're trying to characterize, because there's no easy language available to them.
Right. So maybe we can switch over to the slides and sort of walk through there, because some of my questions may pop up through there. And then if we have time, I understand you also have a video as well too that we might be able to see.
Okay, I was going to show the video pretty early on, but I can wait to show it also. It doesn't matter.
Whatever you think works. If you want to show it when you want to. So.
Okay. Yeah. So you want me to jump in?
Yeah.
I will. Okay, I'll share my screen now. Please let me know if there are any technical difficulties. Immediately stop me if there are. So I'm sharing my screen. This set of slides, I am. Are you able to see a set of slides called "In Search of Our Black Queer Ancestors"? Okay, great. Yeah. So I'm calling it this talk that. On the right is a headline from 1888 titled "The Queen Raided." It was a front page story in a Washington, D.C. newspaper describing a raid on Swann's birthday ball. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which is actually the video. So there is a great video that the BBC did. It's short. I think in terms of an hour-long presentation, it's 5 minutes, but I think it's a great summary, and it will answer a lot of questions and perhaps raise some that will drive the discussion forward. So I will actually, what I need you to do is jump out, switch screens, and reshare from here. So I'll do that.
Swann was as out as you could be in the 19th century. He was so out that the President of the United States knew about him. It was well known within Washington, D.C., which is where he lived, that he was the leader of a queer community. I'm a cultural historian and journalist focusing on the history of queer Black people in America. That impulse led me to just dig through all the archives and records I could find And that led me to a Washington Post article from 1888 describing a police raid on a drag ball. And I had never heard of a drag ball happening that long ago. I didn't know that that the word drag even existed that far back. William Dorsey Swann was born in Hancock, Maryland, to enslaved parents. And the 19th and early 20th century was not so much about public performances. It was about leading a group of people together. The balls that Swann held were really private affairs that the only way anybody would know about them is because the police raided them. Swann is the world's first drag queen. The reason I say that is because he's the first documented person to use the term queen to describe himself in the context of a ball or party that was described by its participants as a drag. Drag is organized in modern day around houses led by mothers, based around dance and beauty contests. Well, those are elements that existed in Swann's day in the drag culture of the 19th century. We use the term drag queen now, or queen, to describe a male person wearing a dress. Oftentimes that's how it's used in contemporary language. In Swann's day, the term queen signified a leader, somebody who held an honored place within the community.
Drag comes with power. It also comes with a platform. It also comes with responsibility. And it's all in the way that you utilize those three things. Drag queens can command attention, just by being in the room without saying a word, just by their presence alone. My name is Harmonica Sunbeam, and I am a drag performer, hostess, and comedian. And I've been doing this for 31 years. I would describe my drag style as somewhere between over the top and casual, wherever that is. But I love wearing jewelry. I love wearing lots of hair and just, being the life of the party, even when there's no party.
Throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, anytime there was a special event, there would often be a cakewalk. Cakewalk was a walking dance, very similar to a Soul Train dance, very similar to voguing, very similar to second line, in which participants would strut and they would improvise the way they moved their bodies. Whoever won this cakewalk got a cake as a prize, which is why it was called a cakewalk. During Swann's lifetime, he was sent to jail numerous times for holding drag balls after police raids. He faced beatings. He faced losing a job. He faced loss of friends, all because of his effort to really build a community around queerness and drag in the 19th century. The prosecutor charged Swann with a crime called keeping a disorderly house. That was a euphemism for running a house of prostitution. That's not what Swann was doing, obviously. Swann pleaded not guilty. He was convicted anyway.
I think William Dorsey Swann's life really resonated with me, despite the fact that this man was a former slave and had been through a lot. It makes me feel very proud to know that this man, so early on, was fighting for rights or fighting for our freedom of expression.
I would like to think that Swann would feel honored by there being so many high-profile queens in the world who make a living, who are on television. It would be my hope that over time people could understand what his contribution was to creating that world, and that we could all honor him by acknowledging sort of the roots of drag in America.
That video always, particularly when it comes to harmonica sunbeam, it always makes me smile like ear to ear. I want to now talk about some of the slides and give some background. I can, what I'd like to do is sort of talk a little bit more about Swann's background, early life, how he got to Washington, D.C., and some of the figures that followed Swann, because I think lots of people ask me sort of about the connection to the present day, and I think there's a sort of a chain of events that I can at least touch on.
Sure. Great.
So going back to my slides, I'm gonna do this. All right. I clicked it and I shouldn't have.
Swann.
So I'm gonna go back to the slides and just press forward. Okay. So this was a slide where I normally talk about what inspired me. I talked about that earlier. My work on genealogy. I became obsessed with genealogy, and here are some documents I found along the way in which my ancestors are featured. On the right is a list of enslaved people who are being sold, advertised in a newspaper for an auction, and the yellow highlight points to my ancestor Stephen, who was up for auction. And on the left is a document from 1843, in which Stephen, many years later, attends an auction in which his sons are being sold on the auction block, and he bids upon them in order to purchase them and emancipate them from slavery. So that sort of idea of where Aquinas fits into that whole mix got me started. And this is the first article that I found. It's from the Washington Post. The title is "A Negro Died Raided. 13 Black men dressed as women surprised at supper and arrested."
So Channing, we're not seeing your slides.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
I can go back. That's where always tell me when I'm not sharing my screen. Okay, are you seeing the screen now? This is the original. The slide's talking. Okay, talking about the enslaved people. Okay, and then the next slide is a Washington Post article. So the Washington Post article that sort of started my journey sort of many years ago, 15 years ago at least. I was not certain at the beginning that this was going to be something that I became obsessed with, because I thought that surely someone else must know about this and be doing research on it. It took me quite a few years to discover that I was the only one doing it, so I needed perhaps it was of greater importance than I thought. So this is the first article that I found. It's from the Washington Post. "A Negro dive raided. 13 Black men dressed as women surprised at supper and arrested." This is the first article that I found, but it is not the first ball of swans that have been raided by the police in Washington, D.C. By this time, the police of Washington, D.C. had already been on alert for Swann and his group, and were constantly sort of looking for opportunities to raid the gatherings. Dressing in drag or dressing as a woman was not illegal in Washington, D.C. So the judges and police had to sort of twist themselves into knots to find a reason to hold them. And so they would charge them with things like vagrancy, with the interestingly worded being a suspicious character. That would be a charge that they could hold somebody for a period of time. And keeping a disorderly house was a charge that was often used. It did not always mean prostitution, but oftentimes it did, and so that there was a stigma attached to that as well.
It's interesting. It's interesting in that article that you just had up, that what triggered at least what the article says is what triggered the police's interest was the strange looking females entering the house. And so in whose opinion were they strange?
According to what I could find, there was a young policeman who was on patrol who noticed some women he thought looked strange, and decided to investigate. And so his investigation involved asking someone in a neighboring house to let him up to a window in order so that he could spy in on the party.
Oh,
And
wow.
when he confirmed that what he thought was happening. And as I said before, the police already were on alert for drag balls by Swann, and so he, confirming the party was a drag, went back and reported to the police precinct, and then his fellow officers prepared the raid that happened later that evening. This is the previous year, a raid that occurred the previous year in 1887. This one is interesting because it lays out what many of the attendees were wearing. People often ask, what were they wearing? This indicates they nearly all had on low neck and short sleeve silk dresses, several of them with trains. They all wore corsets, bustles, long hose, and slippers, and everything that goes to make a female's dress complete in 1887. One of them had on a pink satin Mother Hubbard trimmed with fur, a long wig and bangs and pink hose, and old gold slippers, bogus diamond earrings and breastpins, and a pearl necklace. So what I take from this is sort of their tastes are sort of lavish. They're trying their best, but they have limited resources. But there's this I think a desire to embody sort of the image of an elite, powerful woman. Oftentimes that's what we see in these parties. The next slide. The next slide is my endorsement from the Whiting Foundation, which you talked about earlier. I won't read it, or maybe I should. It just describes how expands our understanding of history of African American history and LGBT history. LGBT history is oftentimes really, really diverse. People are studying all kinds of different things. And it's because of that, it's a very interdisciplinary field. Colleagues of mine who are queer historians are studying, they're studying Jewish history. They're studying history of prisons. They're studying Asian American history, right? And in some ways, as a field, I think we are still there's still so much research that has to be done to bring all of these disparate parts together into one cohesive whole. I think that's because history is queer history. There should be an element of queer history should be part of all history that is taught and that is studied. I'll go forward to skip through. This is a sort of a summary. I won't let you read. Hopefully you won't have to read all this because I'm going to go through each bit. But Swann was born in 1860, died in 1925. Self-described as a drag queen, was an activist and leader of an early queer organization, lived a daily life as a man, worked in various jobs as a laborer, as a janitor, sometimes as a coachman or driver, which involved taking care of horses at the time, and sometimes as a tailor, helping out his sister and younger brother. Making dresses. Swann organized drag balls or drags. Drag was used as a noun for other formerly enslaved people in Washington, D.C. The balls combine the European tradition of masquerade balls, which are similar to Halloween balls that we know today, where people get dressed up in costume. In an age prior to radio and television and other forms of entertainment, getting dressed up was one of the most popular ways to have fun. So Swann's balls combined that tradition with the African American tradition of the Cakewalk, which is a dance contest that was created by enslaved people that allowed them to mock their slaveholders in this subtle way that it allowed them to essentially make fun of their slaveholders in a way that wasn't noticed or that didn't cause alarm by the people who were holding them. So it was a very sophisticated way to provide social commentary on the unjust world that they were living in. Swann's balls were repeatedly raided by the police. His group is the earliest documented queer resistance organization. And that's a significant achievement in light of the era's rigid attitudes about sexuality and gender. One example that I like to point to indicate some of the rigidity of the era. This is prior to the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in America. Oftentimes women suffragists were called horrible names, one of which was the third sex, which is indicating that because they wanted their full rights as citizens, that they were not quite women anymore. That's the sense of rigidity of that Swann and people of his time were facing in terms of gender roles. Swann is the earliest documented person to be known as a queen of a cross-dressing ball, described as a drag. Obviously, Swann is not the first person to ever put on women's clothes. That doesn't make any sense. But it's the first person to be self-described as a drag queen. That's a word that we commonly know today, and that's where the word comes from. Holding the title of queen of the drag, or drag queen, signified that Swann had an honored place in the community. And that usage of drag queen continued for some decades, before the commonplace usage that we have today, simply describing a man in a dress, became the most common usage. Swann fought police raids, petitioned President Grover Cleveland more than once for a pardon. And authorities often, they knew about him and were really upset with what he was doing. They said he was an evil example in the community, which on the one hand is an insult. On the other hand, it really acknowledged that they felt like he was having an influence on the people around him. People were following his example. Swann was followed after his heyday in Washington, D.C. ended. That was not the end of drag in D.C. By any means. Other queens who led and hosted balls in D.C. were Rufus Hall, Alden Garrison, Mother Louise Diggs, and others who followed into the mid-20th century. And the houses of 21st century ballroom culture, which are still chosen families led by queens and mothers, still have the same basic structure as Swann's balls. This is a picture of the area where Swann grew up in. It's on the border of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. It's quite a rural area. I visited there. It is quite difficult to get to even now. He was born enslaved, and his father was an enslaved farmer, a wheat farmer, and his mother was an enslaved woman who was obviously very strong and managed to raise a very large family. Their slaveholders were Catholic. They actually insisted that the children and one of his siblings grow up in the Catholic faith, which is interesting considering that they were slaveholders. This is the church that Swann and his siblings were baptized in, St. Peter's Church in Hancock, Maryland, which still stands to this day. Picture of Washington, D.C. Back in the 1860s. As you see, the Capitol Dome is still being built. And if you look closely there, you can see the fashions of the day in terms of the women's dresses and hats and so on. I just show this to give a sort of a visual of what Washington once was. I talk about this. Okay, this slide is Emancipation Day. Emancipation Day was a very important moment culturally in Washington, D.C. post-Civil War. this is part of the origin story of Queen, right? So this is actually a picture. There are no photographs surviving that we know of from Emancipation Day in Washington, D.C., but there is one that exists from Richmond, Virginia. So Emancipation Day was the celebration of the end of slavery in Washington, D.C. It was celebrated with an enormous parade every year. That parade involved Black people from all over Washington walking through the streets and celebrating. One of the most controversial pieces of the parade, though, was a float covered in flowers that celebrated liberty. Featured on the float was the goddess of liberty, or the queen of liberty, queen of freedom. These are all terms that were used, and that would have been a very familiar cultural reference to Black people in Washington, D.C., the queen of freedom. These are examples, because there are no photographs from Washington, these are examples from Emancipation Day queens from Corpus Christi, Texas in 1913. Usually these queens were, Black women who embodied the idea of liberty. Again, this is one of the major stories featured on the front page of a newspaper. The Queen raided. Unexpected interruption to her banquet and ball. This is one of the earlier video. I described how Swann appealed for pardon from the president. This is an example of one of the documents that was submitted on Swann's behalf in his application for a pardon. Pardon is denied. President has denied the application for pardon in the case of William D. Swann, convicted in the District of Columbia of keeping a disorderly house. Oh, that's great. It's a picture of the Cakewalk. This is a video, not a video, this is a photograph of the Cakewalk from, I think, 1901. Yes, 1901 at the Pan American Exposition. And these pictures may be familiar, but the story behind them might not be. So you remember from the video earlier from the BBC, these are the same dancers that were featured in that Cakewalk film from 1903 in France. So in the early 20th century, the Cakewalk, which had been a dance that was invented by enslaved people, it became so popular that people all over Europe were obsessed with it and wanted to learn how to do it. It became profitable for white theaters, white-owned theaters in Paris in particular, to advertise shows of Americans performing the Cakewalk. These two are Black Americans performing the Cakewalk in Lyon, France. The person in a dress is Jack Brown, who was a performer from Petersburg, Virginia. And Jack Brown's partner is unknown. We do not yet know his name. Since we witnessed this earlier, but I'll just show it again because I think it's good to see. It's a short one. The Cakewalk performed at the New Circus, Nouveau Silk. As you see, it was really important to have freedom of movement in your outfits. No matter how elaborate they were, it was important if you were going to go to a dance that you still be able to move freely, while also sporting the latest fashions. This slide sort of fast forwards into the future, right? So this is 30 years. This is where I'd like to sort of stop and meditate a moment about the legacy of Swann. As I mentioned earlier, Swann's other drag queens followed in Swann's footsteps, and they were called pansies. The community was called pansies often. These are derogatory terms, but they represent a positive development because it means that the community is seen as a community. They're not seen, in Swann's day, oftentimes the group was described not as a a community or they were just described as deviants, right? There's a conception now in popular culture by 1932 that this is a community of people, that that their behavior is stable, that there are traditions involved and a culture attached to this community. Despite that, newspapers, including the Black press, which is, this is the Baltimore Afro-American, publishing stories called entitled "Our Pansies People." This story caused such a stir that it prompted a response from one of the leading queens of Washington, D.C., Louis Diggs. Diggs wrote a story in response titled "A Defense of Pansies" by one of them. One of the first known public defenses of Black queer people in history. Getting to some of these, I'll explain each of these. These are newspaper articles from the 30s. Each one represents a chain of evidence that I think is really interesting. The one on the far left has a headline which states, "Mother Louis Diggs hailed as Alexandria's Queenie." What's important about that is it shows, the article describes Louis Diggs being bestowed the title of Queen or Queenie, and being referred to as mother. So these are terms that on the one hand, they're terms that still exist to this day in ballroom culture, where leaders are called mothers. And the term queen, which is also, the alternative is also Queenie. The article uses both, queen and Queenie. The term queen and Queenie, terms queen and Queenie are still being used as positions or titles of honor, as they were in Swann's day. The second article is from 1930, it's actually 5 years earlier. And that's the middle article, which is just the headline, "Art Club Cannot Agree on Male Queen" for 1930. This one here is an extension of it. And lower down in the article, it states that occasionally at this grand ball that's being described, one of the younger ones would stop to speak to an elder as mother, auntie, or madam. And so just, again, the concept and the culture of chosen families, mothers as leaders, subordinate people as children, and so on, is already in effect at this time. And the language that's used, that we use today on Pose and on RuPaul's Drag Race, such as sachet and strike a pose and Vogue, are terms that are sprinkled throughout, this article from 1931, which is titled 31 Debutantes Bow at Pansy, local Pansy Ball. This is also Louis Diggs, and I think it's interesting because I think Diggs is beautiful in this picture, but the title of it is "He's a Draftee," believe it or not. It was describing how Diggs had been drafted to fight in World War II. 1937, more positive coverage of balls and what term that was used at the time, female impersonators. As you can see, self-expression, freedom of movement, fashion, elegance are all high priorities in the culture. This is another photograph from Baltimore, I think 1931. And I think it's great. This picture, as far as I know, only exists in a newspaper. If somebody can find the original, I would love to see it. Again, sort of expanding from the seed of, activist drag resistance in Washington, D.C., you see Baltimore, you see Chicago, throughout the early 20th century, ball culture is beginning to flourish in many other cities. Let me know if I should stop here now, or do you think or should I go on?
Well, let's stop for a second here because there's just so much stuff that's here. It's really deep. Going back to Swann for a moment, you use the term activist, and I think it's a really great term for him. And then also you've brought up a number of issues here with regard to, and again, I'm now using today's words, but let's say he, in many ways, it seems like he could have been an activist for Black rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights.
Mhm.
Any sense of which one was more important? Did he sense that he was, did you get a sense that he was sort of talking about the intersectionality of all of that?
Those are great questions. I think my answer has to be limited by what I know from the archive, right? So, I mean, archive doesn't give me direct answers to those questions about what Swann thought of the rights of other groups and so on. But what I do see in Swann's life is a commitment to doing something that was deeply unpopular, that got him in trouble multiple times, that required lots of sacrifice. I also know of other people in his life who were close people who, you know, one person who was a teacher and also an employer of his when he moved to Washington from Maryland, was an early activist for women's suffrage. And so she gave him a job. She defended him after he got arrested a few times. She helped, was helping to support his education, which meant learning to read, because enslaved people don't learn that. And so I would think, within the context of having somebody who is herself an activist, who is serving in the role of a mentor and a protector and an ally in such a way, has to be something that would have been deeply influential to Swann.
Mm-hmm. Is there much known about Swann's life? And one note I saw about the idea that there are no photographs known. There are no known photographs of him. I don't know if that's
known photographs.
But did he have a lover? Did he live in a family? What was his community like?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So the Swann's early community was a group of enslaved people in Hancock, Maryland. His family was very large and very close. Mm-hmm. And so when Swann moves to Washington, when he's about 20, 21 years old, he goes in order to find a job to help support his family back home. And that continues over many decades. So he maintains close relationships with his family throughout all of it. And helps to take care of his mother and father later in his life and their lives. His sisters and brothers actually helped with the drag balls. Actually, two of his brothers attended the balls. At least one of them attended in drag, we know. And one of them later on became one of the only sort of well-known African-American and out queer tailors of Washington, D.C. of the early 20th century. I say he was out because his name had appeared in newspapers many times after being arrested for drag balls. So he was somebody that would have served in the community, and did serve in the community, making outfits for the Black community until the 50s when he died. So Swann's sister also was a tailor and what's called a seamstress was the term that was used at the time, and she also helped him procure outfits. Procure means stealing many times, but it also means a combination of gifting, stealing, and original creations. Swann was very close with at least two other two other Black men, one of whom was named Jacob Byard, who helped Swann host balls. Another named Pierce Lafayette was another close friend who has an amazing story of his own. He had been married and had been close to several leaders in the Confederacy, and so he had sort of an upper middle class life as a government official, sort of a low level government official in Washington. So that friendship was, Swann's friendship with Pierce allowed him some sort of protection in that way for a period of time.
It's just so fascinating to me when we think about how these communities and this culture is handed down from generation to generation. To think about that cohort that you're speaking about, that there had to be certain things that they learned from elders. And obviously there had to be some secrecy around it. There had to be some alternative means of being able to get what they wanted to have, like you were saying, procured in the broadest sense there. They had to give each other emotional support to continue. And what I think a lot about today, I look at some of the stuff in our archives at Stonewall, and a lot of it has come from white gay men and a lot of these serials and publications that we have. And in many, many of them in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there are very few references to people of color, except you might see them performing as drag queens at some of those gay bars. So I have imagined that there was a culture or coterie around those performers, that they might have been in Miami, or they might have been in Orlando, or they might have been in Atlanta, or they might have been in New Orleans. But there had to be a group of people who were supportive around them. That was their family who were helping them. And that's probably no different of a culture than what Swann had as well too, or community.
I think that all of that's true. I think there is so much more research to be done about early queer culture and people, and for various reasons, people aren't doing it. Hopefully, my work can inspire other people to get involved. This work focuses on Washington, D.C. By necessity. But as I said, there's so much more work that needs to be done to pull together all of those threads into one place. What was happening in New Orleans? What was happening in Chicago? What was happening even in Baltimore that might have been different from Washington, D.C., even though they're very close.
Yeah. And that learned culture, that generational passage of those things, and of course the roles of the mothers and the queens is very important, because it sounds to me like those individuals were taking on almost parental roles, but it wasn't just to the individuals, it was to the culture as well too. They were trying to pass that information on to another generation, because they knew it wasn't going to be the normal means of communication were not going to transmit that information.
Yes, that's a queer ancestor. That's queer genealogy, passing on the culture from mother to child, auntie to child, sister to sister.
But also, the other question I had, or just observation, was in looking at some of those articles. If we can put ourselves into sort of the heads of white men and upper class white women in the 1860s, 1870s, where they felt empowered in so many ways, and they saw even into the early part of the 20th century, and they saw those articles in the paper. Would they have just been completely dismissive of the individuals that they saw in those articles, that this was just, deviant behavior on the edges of culture? Or would it have been interesting to them?
I grapple with that question myself a lot. And oftentimes I grapple with it in the context of why it is that there are so few records of, for example, what enslaved people's dance traditions or songs or linguistic traditions were. It's simply because the white people who were enslaving them or who were just around at the time, even if they weren't enslaving them, had no curiosity whatsoever about this. I think, how can it be for decades on decades that nobody thought, oh, they're doing an interesting dance there. Why don't I record it? Why don't I ask them what that's called? Why don't I see the importance of it? So I think there's that element that's definitely at play. I think particularly post-slavery, post-emancipation, newspapers are looking for sources of income. Sources of, I just wrote a big piece in The Nation about newspapers' role in promoting slavery. Well, one of the ways that they supported slavery was through classified ads, advertising slave auctions and runaway slaves, right? That was a big source of income throughout the slavery period. Post-slavery, they had to look for other forms of income. That other form of income involves very sensational journalism, promoting lynchings, promoting other things. And so within that context, just front page stories describing deviant, sexual deviance, particularly Negro sexual deviance, would have been quite interesting and in line with that sort of approach that you see.
It would have fit within their business model, as you suggest there. Well, we only have a few minutes left. Do you have a few more slides that you want to show before we?
Well, sure. So I was the slides that I have left are mainly talking about other queer people that I could sort of actually go on and on about them, but I can just very quickly, why don't I run through it?
See, we just get started with these talks, and then we run out of time, of course, because there's so much.
So this is and because in the description we talk about, oh, there's Peter Sewally and so on. So Peter Sewally, also called Mary Jones, also called Anna Eliza Evans, also called Julia Johnson. So you pick one. Is a very interesting figure in New York in the 1830s. Sowali had been a sailor in the earlier part of life, and coming back to New York, not having sailing as an income, turned to prostitution as a woman, and received lots of coverage in the newspaper. Was called the man monster, was called beefsteak Pete, and all kinds of other words, and was one of early America's first introductions to sort of an outsized queer Black figure that in many ways they were trying to destroy, but in effect they made Sowali a legend that we're talking about to this day. So there's that. So that's Sowali. Francis Thompson is a very interesting one. Different era. This is 1870s, 60s and 70s in Memphis. So post Civil War, there was a huge riot, a race riot in Memphis. The white people attacked the Black community, burned buildings, raped people, killed people. The result of that was that Francis Thompson was gang raped. He subsequently testified in front of a congressional committee saying, "This is what happened to me." That testimony was used to support legislation supporting Reconstruction. So it promoted the idea that the South needed a plan for Reconstruction to reunite the country post the Civil War, after the Civil War. That was her contribution to America, right? That would have been enough, except 10 years later, she's discovered to have been originally assigned as male. And so she is forced to wear masculine attire, is lambasted in the press as a fraud, and that series of that news coverage is used to undo all the things that had been done in her name 10 years before. So this is a person who is actually central to the story of Reconstruction in America, and despite that, you will hardly hear her name in discussions about it.
Right, just amazing.
Marsha P. Johnson, who we talked about before, is oftentimes celebrated and described as transgender. Marsha, in her lifetime, identified as a drag queen. And so there are historical reasons, I think, and legitimate reasons to use either term. I just leave her as that. And I'm just sort of giving examples of like other Black queer people who are significant in history. And there are many more I could include. Hopefully in the rest of my career, I can spend a lot more time exploring some of those people and reintegrating them and their importance into American history. So I will.
Well, we would love to have you come and visit us here in South Florida and to be able to do some research on these topics, because obviously it's so incredibly rich, this entire field in this entire area. So the book about William Dorsey Swann, that will be out in next year. And what's the title of the book? Just remind everybody.
The title is House of Swann, Where Slaves Became Queens and Changed the World, being published by Crown.
Great. And we look forward to that. And Channing Gerard Joseph, thank you so much for being here. It's been great to chat with you. Great to meet you. And I hope you come visit us in Fort Lauderdale the next time you could come to South Florida.
I certainly hope so, and I look forward to it. And if anybody in the audience wants to contact me, feel free to Google me, and I'm easy to email. So
I just want to say thank you to Emma, who's behind the scenes there. Emma, thank you for all your help this evening. If you want to show yourself and just wave to us, would be great. And there you are. Thank you. Thanks for your help. And good night, everybody. It's great to see you all. And we'll be back with another episode next week. Good night. Thank you.